Here we go. So my name is Emily Liner, and I'm the founder of Friendly City Books. And while I currently live and work in Columbus, Mississippi, I previously lived and worked in Washington, D.C. And this is a really exciting opportunity for me to kind of scratch the itch of my previous career working in economic policy to have this great conversation with Brad DeLong, the author of Slouching Towards Utopia, Kate Bahn, an old friend from the Washington Center for Economic Growth, and Nick Timiraos, an even older friend from the Wall Street Journal. So I'm going to turn over to Kate. She's going to introduce our speakers. We're going to let them talk for a while, and then we're going to have a conversation together.
Great. Thank you, Emily, and thank you to Friendly City Books for inviting me to MC today's event, and welcome to everyone who's watching this discussion. So I have the honor to be here to introduce Brad DeLong's impressive new book, Slouching Toward Utopia. Brad is a professor of economics at University of California, Berkeley, and a leading economic historian. He's also well known to many as an economics blogger, and I see the relevance of this book in the tradition of economics blogging, which brings an accessible and engaging voice to sophisticated economic analysis that shapes the stories we tell about the economy. And economics is ultimately about storytelling. And economic history is one way to tell the story of economics so we can understand our world. So while the book covers what Brad has defined as a long 20th century from 1870 to 2010, I think it's also informative to the current moment as well. And the achievement of this book is also its iterative process of going between economic history and the economic frameworks we use to understand the economy. Between these two are politics and policy, which I see as being shaped by economic history and the frameworks and thinkers informing how we understand it. So for an example, I'll go back to right before the long 20th century, exemplified by Malthus' concept that Brad refers to in the book, where growing human populations are held back by resource scarcity. This is one framework for understanding the economy before the 20th century. But to get a sense of what I mean by sort of the moment in history and how we understand it and how that's relevant to how we analyze policy and politics, Marx's early writing and thinking was greatly informed by Malthus. And so this is an example of two different thinkers and how they understood things differently, because Marx in many ways, his early work was in opposition to Malthus, where Malthus saw natural processes of human reproduction and attributed social control as the solution to some of those processes. Marx saw scarcity and distribution as shaped by capitalist production, which in turn led to the conclusion of reshaping production processes. And this book moves beyond that moment in economic history to one in which there was rapid economic growth and an undeniable increase in standards of living. Two of the main thinkers among many featured in this book who developed the frameworks that help us understand this and shape both politics and policy are Hayek and Polanyi, who developed frameworks for understanding the economy. And this opus uses these frameworks and stories to highlight three major shifts that allowed for this rapid change in the economy: industrial research, modern corporations, and globalization. I won't review any more of the content of the book, so I'll leave that up to Brad, who will be joined by Nick Timiraos, who's the chief economic correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Brad and Nick will have a discussion together, and then I'll be opened up to Emily and me to talk about it a little bit more. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more.
Great. Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Brad, for taking time to discuss your book today. I guess the first question, this was a very, I found it a very deep and accessible book, which is difficult to do. So the first question is rather broad. Why did you write this book?
I guess for the same reason that I do a podcast with Noah Smith, that we were complaining that there weren't enough podcasts that we like to listen to. And so we said, gee, we should do one. Let's do the podcast we like to listen to. So I wrote this book because it was the book I wanted to read. And no one else seemed to be writing it. So I went from I want to read this book to nobody else is writing it, to somebody, definitely maybe me, maybe I should write this book, to here's a chapter, so to show people I'm thinking about writing this book. And then nothing happened for a decade, and then Tim Sullivan of Basic Books came around and said, let's put you under contract because you aren't writing this, somebody should. And if you're under contract, I can call you every year and yell at you for not producing a manuscript. And so he did it, I agreed, and lo and behold, here we are. And now he's tweeting at me saying, I told you so. I told you it would be a great book. I told you you should actually do it. I have.
Very good. So you write about the long 20th century, which you begin in 1870, end in 2010. And I want to start with 1870. What is it that makes this the beginning of the period that you call the most consequential years of all humanity's centuries? Because there are other historians that will pick a period earlier in the 19th century, and then 1914 is a popular period to start.
Indeed. 2 weeks ago at Berkeley, we had Robert Brenner up from UCLA, who director of their Center for Political Economy and Social Theory, who was smacking me around saying that, yes, there's an argument for 1870, but there's a much stronger argument for 1600. Because at least in England and in the Netherlands, the economy after 1600 there looks a lot more like the post-1870 economies than it looks like the economies elsewhere in the world in 1600, or indeed the economies before. That the key thing is not technology, but rather, the fact that you replace peasants, knights, and lords with farmers, workers, merchants, manufacturers, and a king and mercenaries. That it's the change in how human society was organized that was key, and that brought the technology with it. I chose technology. I chose the fact that the rate at which we humans managed to improve and deploy our technologies for manipulating nature and for organizing ourselves, that rate of technological growth more than quadrupled around 1870. Which means that after there's the prospect of actually being able to bake a sufficiently large economic pie so that everybody can have enough. While before 1870, there is absolutely no such prospect of baking such a sufficiently large pie.
So what is it about this period that led to such progress? We began, you write about running towards utopia. What was it that allowed that to begin through this period?
Well, it's the last three institutions, or some people are saying I should call them meta institutions, falling into place. That we had a whole bunch of things. I suppose you could go back to the investiture crisis of the 1070s and the establishment of the principle that law is not just a tool, but that it even binds and constrains what the most powerful can do. Or you could go back to, say, Hero of Alexandria in 150 experimenting with steam, or indeed back to the invention of coinage in what's now Turkey in -600. But, none of the societies before make any kind of breakthrough into rapid economic growth. And we as humanity don't do it anywhere until after 1870, when we finally get the industrial research laboratory to rationalize and routinize the discovery and development of new technologies, the modern corporation to rationalize and routinize the development and deployment of new technologies, and that in the context of globalization, of full globalization of the global market economy with the telegraph and the steamship and the railroad, so that the incentives and the ability to take modern technologies and diffuse them throughout the world economy become overwhelmingly great. It's those three things that notch us up from a world in which, technology is really kind of like what it was when your grandmother was born, and your life is not all that different from hers, to a world in which humanity's technological prowess doubles every generation. So the economy is revolutionized every generation and then re-revolutionized again.
You write about a shotgun marriage between Hayek and Polanyi. Introduce us to these figures. Assume very little knowledge of these two individuals, and walk me through what this marriage was and why it was so important in your view.
Well, after 1870, technology is changing so much as so to double human productivity every generation, which means that we kind of have a rapidly a brand new set of forces of production hardware in the world economy every generation. And on top of that, we need to construct, an economy, economic relationships and sociological political relationships too. We need to construct the economic and sociological software that will run on top of this hardware. And we need to cobble together brand new ones on the fly every generation because the old software just won't run as things are so different. And the question is, how do you cobble together a set of sociological and economic institutions to deal with the fact that your technology now is very different than it was before? One point of view was that adopted by Friedrich von Hayek and by his followers, which is that, the market economy is an enormously productive institution for crowdsourcing solutions to human problems, provided that we can align market prices with social values. Because if you do that, then the system of private property and market exchange, it means that the people with the information, where the information is, can actually take action, as opposed to having to follow the routines of some bureaucracy or the commands of some central authority. And you also have the people with the information actually seeing what is going on also have a strong incentive, to take that action, to increase wealth, which is a good thing if wealth is aligned with social values. As opposed to if you have a constructed bureaucracy or a central planner where God knows what the person who's actually writing down how the bureaucracy should function or what the commands will be, God knows what they think is actually going on. So Friedrich von Hayek was the first and the one to see most strongly how uniquely effective the market economy can be as a crowdsourcing mechanism for getting everyone's brain pulling in harness to figure out how to solve our problems, rather than to have everyone be kind of software bots following some bureaucratic regimen laid out by a few people in a committee, or obeying the commands of someone who is the boss and being not so much software bots as hardware bots. So Hayek said, that's great. The market creates enormous amounts of wealth, but that's all we can do. The market is neither just nor unjust. It just is. It doesn't really care about us. It just cares about creating wealth. But we try to do anything more and things will go horribly wrong. We'll wind up on the road to serfdom. Therefore the market giveth, the market taketh away. Blessed be the name of the market. And it was Karl Polanyi, coming from the same Austro-Hungarian milieu as did Friedrich von Hayek, who said, no, that won't work at all. You try to do that, you then create try to present the market economy as a very stark utopia. But what you've done is you've then said that there are no rights that matter except for property rights. And the only property rights that matter are those that that own things for which the rich have a serious Jones and are willing to pay. That the only people with social power are the current rich who've been lucky with the market. And people simply will not stand for that. People want stable communities they recognize. People want to have continuity of their occupation at least. People want to have the income they deserve. And they also want other people to have the income that they deserve, especially if they don't deserve very much. And in a market society, all of these, the very fabric of your life, will disappear and blow away if some rootless cosmopolite 5,000 miles away decides that your life doesn't satisfy a maximum profitability test. People won't stand for that, attempt to impose a market utopia. And what will happen is society will react, society will rebel. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be genocidal, it may be progressive, they'll rebel. That you got to realize that the way people are made, they believe that the market was made for man, not man for the market. And most of history from 1870 on up to 2010, or even today, is usefully seen as people frantically attempting to rewrite the economic and sociological relations software code on which society runs as the hardware changes, and doing so under the pull of these two currents of the von Hayekian versus the Polanyian.
So to jump forward in time, you write that this shotgun marriage failed its sustainability test.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, they were You can say that von Hayek was by and large dominant from 1870 to 1914, that what people call classical liberalism, although it actually wasn't classical, it was pretty brand new. It was only pseudo-classical, and it was only semi-liberal because it gave an awful lot of social power to inherited wealth and to statuses to what people, status groups to people deferred. But that we ought to have more market, and the market ought to do more. And that called forth the very powerful reactions. Whether the populism of William Jennings Bryan, the progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt, the socialism, the social democracy of Karl Kautsky, the Leninism of Vladimir Lenin, the Stalinism of Joseph Stalin, or the fascism of Benito Mussolini, or the Nazism of Adolf Hitler, people saying these cannot stand. I'm going to start a counter movement attempting to carve back the market one way or another and attracting enormous numbers of followers becoming. Then after World War II, at least in the global north, we have the mixed economy, the idea that yes, the von Hayekian market has a place, but it needs to be married to Karl Polanyi's ideas that it is very important to recognize that the market is servant and not master. Heavily progressive income and inheritance taxes, enormously expanding social welfare programs so that your social power does not just depend on the price the market puts on you. And all of this shotgun marriage, either blessed or the shotgun held by John Maynard Keynes and his ideas that the first job of the government is to maintain full employment. But then this broke down in the 1970s. The new, what Gary Gerstle calls the New Deal order, in another excellent book that I think came out in April called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. The New Deal order that had existed from, say, 1945 to 1980 collapsed, was replaced by what we now seem to call the neoliberal order. The ideas, either the ideas of Reagan and Thatcher, or you have to maneuver in such a way that you have to talk to and convince at least some of the supporters of Reagan and Thatcher, which has produced our current situation. I don't know, I may be the wrong person to have written this part of the book because I still don't understand why it broke down so completely for what seemed to me to be relatively minor causes. And my friend Ying-Yi Qian says this means that I truly do not understand, the hold that the neoliberal ideas that, what's wrong with social democracy and with the New Deal order is that while it's important to treat people who are equal equally, it's important to treat people who are unequal unequally. And that social democracy failed its test because it was seen as giving too much to moochers and slackers, and also was much too over-bureaucratized as well. But yes, we had still in the situation where by now we certainly have solved what every previous century would have said was the problem of baking a sufficiently large economic pie. We now have an economic pie, have enough wealth that any previous century would say you must be living in a utopia. Because once you have such material abundance, the problems of slicing and tasting the pie, the problems of equitably enough distributing it, and then utilizing it so we can live lives wisely and well, those are second order and much less difficult problems. And yet here we are with the problems of slicing and tasting have manifestly flummoxed us and continue to flummox us.
So you write about how this great 20th century ended about 10 years ago in 2010. And I guess the question I have is, at what point do you think, or how much conviction do you have that it ended versus did it pause? One could have written, a 10 or 15-year break in this long century of progress in the 1930s, right? So has anything in the last, it feels like we've been through a lot in the last 2 years. I feel like I've aged 20 years in the last 2 years. Has anything changed your mind about whether, or what would have to happen to change your mind about the fact that this didn't actually end? It was interrupted, it paused, but we were able to continue our movement towards utopia with maybe more than a slouch.
Well, this is actually what Larry Summers was thwacking me about last week. In his class that he made me come and give a guest lecture to, afterwards, and then over at Harvard Bookstore, where he and I did an event, that the story hasn't ended, was Larry's strong position. That we still have technological change at an enormous rate, even if not as fast as it was in what Robert Gordon calls, the one big wave from 1870 to 1980 or so. You still have large social problems of distribution and utilization. We have global warming added to our old problems of utilization as still another way in which we are misusing our immense wealth to do things we don't want it to. Why did I not just say the story continues? And the problem is that even when I'm right, I lose arguments to Larry in person. Because he is so convincing and so overwhelming and can think of so many reasons so fast. Let me say what I should have said to him, which is that the long 20th century is characterized, not just by, Schumpeterian creative destruction, whole occupations, industries, livelihoods, communities, uprooted and essentially destroyed every single generation, and then it does it again. It's characterized not just by that and by the frantic attempts to write von Hayekian or Polanyian sociological economic software code to deal with this. It's also that the process of growth is fast enough that utopia seems to be coming much closer if only we could grasp it. That economic growth is genuinely rapid, that the United States is, as Leon Trotsky said, the furnace where the future is being forged is exceptional, both in terms of providing an economic, political, sociological model for other countries to at least think about, if not adopt, and also as very much the conductor of the world of a common world orchestra, searching for a better future. Then, and plus there is a very strong sense that, increasing the franchise and distributing the abundance through a market economy, liberal democratic capitalism, as Frank Fukuyama likes to call it, is indeed likely to be the wave of the future. Those are kind of gone. The US is no longer viewed as an exceptional nation. No one in China thinks America has anything to teach us. Back in 2003, the US stopped being a kind of semi-benevolent, even hegemon, and began saying we are going to do what we want. And other countries began to kind of think that not just that they should follow, but they should actually counter American leadership. There's been this sharp slowdown in productivity growth, which if it doesn't resume means that the destruction part of creative destruction, which continues, is no longer so obviously offset by very rapidly rising living standards or potential living standards, because, wage stagnation in the US over the past generation has largely been because of increasing income inequality. Plus, we have the brand new problem of global warming, which we're manifestly not dealing with, but the monsoon appears to have moved 200 miles south in Asia this year, and this is a very bad thing. Plus the idea that liberal democracy is at least a good system or the best system. Well, Xi Jinping now is making his own bid, and instead of the von Hayekian economy yoked to Karl Polanyi's concern for social democracy, blessed by John Maynard Keynes's prioritizing full employment. In China right now, we have von Hayek yoked to Lenin, married to Lenin, blessed by Master Kung. Right? That is a Leninist party which strongly believes that it is the boss, backed up by long Asian Confucian traditions of governmental responsibility. So this seems to me to be a very different, a very different set of historical problems that humanity is trying to deal with than a single common set I see as running from 1870 to 2010. Yeah. But on the other hand, I have to give Larry his due, right? In the 1920s, John Maynard Keynes was absolutely petrified that the progressive world order of 1870 to 1914 had collapsed and that people would be unable to rebuild it. That it was not a story of a century, but just of 50 good years, which had come to an end. And yet somehow we managed to pick up the story and resume it, starting in 1933 and ending, I think, in 2010.
Well, so to your point, maybe this is more charitable to your side than to Larry's, but I was struck at the Jackson Hole, central banking confab a couple of weeks ago. There was so much talk about the end of the Great Moderation, that the forces of globalization, which had frayed obviously in the middle of the last decade, the U.S. rejecting TPP, the election of Donald Trump, Brexit, that now with the pandemic and the war in Europe, the forces have just accelerated. The demographic forces that had been tailwinds to global labor supply are becoming headwinds. What are the implications, to the extent that's happening? What are the implications for policymakers in the U.S. and in this world, the Western world that defended these ideas over the last several decades? What are the implications for policymakers if these forces, if your argument is being borne out?
Well, that the 21st century is highly likely to be one in which things are more difficult than the long 20th century. That in the long 20th century, we were solving the problems of producing a sufficiently large economic pie, and at least grappling with the problems of distribution, and utilization. But the end of the Great Moderation, the return of major power war, the fact that global warming is now a first order additional utilizational challenge. These are all things, and the undermining of the undermining even in what you think of as the core countries of liberal democracy, of the belief that we ought to be liberal Democrats. That the Federalist Society, which has had considerable success in shaping the American judiciary, now appears to be up there saying that state legislatures should have, and in fact do under a proper reading of the Constitution, have the power to, if they don't like how a bunch of voters have voted, well, then they have the right to overrule the election. Plus, they also have the right to then gerrymander the districts in which they themselves are elected for their own potential benefit. That even during the worst days of the 1930s, and even in November 17th, 1942, the high watermark of the Nazi war machine, you still had strong and very strong commitments to liberal democracy and to a free economy in North America and in Great Britain, if no place else. Those, are now substantially up for grabs. So I'd see a world today that is both immensely richer than the world of the 1930s and the 1940s, but one that has, if anything, gone backward in terms of its ability to handle the problems of slicing and tasting, the problems of distribution and utilization. And whether our additional technological powers put us on balance ahead of them or not, I really cannot tell.
So I'll make this my last question, and I'll turn it back to Kate and to Emily. You write about how you think the political system faltered in a way that surprised you in 2008-9. You write that in September 2008, you've been confident that the world's governments were capable of keeping the world economy out of a deep and long depression. By March of 2009, it was clear that I had been wrong and that they had failed. Given that conclusion, how would you assess the response that governments made during the COVID pandemic, and especially in the US? Did policymakers try too hard to fight the last war? or did they get it right, and now we're dealing with the side effects you get from making decisions that maybe weren't made in 2008, 2009?
Well, I think there were two pieces to the COVID response, right? And the first was kind of that of the public health system and the economic policy system, which is working under immense time pressure with enormous uncertainty, and which I think does quite a good job of figuring out first what we should do and how much we should do to try to slow the spread, so that most people do not get COVID when it is a deadly disease, a potentially deadly disease, but instead when they are four kind of doses of vaccine, plus the availability of Paxlovid and monoclonal antibodies and so forth. And then we need to support the economy while this process takes place. And then we need to reopen the economy so that we don't have another lost decade during which there's not enough demand for a rapid reknitting of the distribution of labor as we open up again. And I think we get pretty full marks, on that. Then there's Donald Trump and, Kevin Hassett and, a cubic fit through Excel saying that the plague will be over by the end of April 2020. Plus reopening, and former Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain going to a mass Trump rally without a mask and promptly dying of COVID. And losing a presidential candidate, not changing the kind of denial. So much so that there are still large numbers of Americans, for whom attacking and threatening to shoot Dr. Anthony Fauci is an applause line. That, I think, tells us something extraordinarily sick about pretty large components of our culture and our society that we need to deal with and to figure out how to deal with. And it's very, very hard to figure out how to do it. But that leaves us in our situation today, where we are trying to rewheel and open up the economy very quickly and open it up in a different configuration, with something like 10% more goods production and significantly fewer numbers of in-store sales people, and more people driving delivery trucks, and a somewhat larger online sector, of which we here are a part, as part of the an online shift for a book event that we wouldn't have had 3 years ago. And that it's going to take some inflation in order to make that happen, because you aren't going to have falling wages in contracting sectors, and that means you need rising wages in expanding sectors to pull people in. Plus, as you reopen, you uncover all those bottlenecks, and you need rising prices of bottlenecked commodities in order for the von Hayekian market to work, in order to concentrate people's attention on, look, here's a bottleneck. We need to figure out how to get around it. There's money to be made here. So that coming out of the COVID plague depression, we were going to have some reopening inflation. The natural rate of inflation was going to be higher than 2% for some period of time, in order to grease this rapid return to full employment. And, as long as it was accepted and believed that this was going to be transitory, that would be a fine thing to have happen. That's not something the Federal Reserve should worry about too much. And indeed, the Federal Reserve did not worry about it for a while, for a year or so, for a year and a quarter. Now the question for government policy, the question for Jay Powell and company, is what do they have to do to maintain confidence that they have in fact got this situation? And how much should they allow this reopening inflation to continue? How much of it that is still a good thing to have because it is greasing the reopening and making more people get better jobs and earn more money and be productive? And how much of it is undermining people's confidence that the Fed has gotten it and that inflation is in fact well anchored so that things will return to normal after this is over? The Federal Reserve is scared to be tightening too much and delay the reopening, is really scared to tighten much too much and put us back into a big recession, because then we'll be back at the zero lower bound in interest rates and the Fed will be unable to get us out of it. And also absolutely, totally petrified that people will lose confidence that it has got this. And people will start saying, gee, inflation is going to be high in the future, and then they will have a hell of a time dealing with the situation. Right now, the fear is that the Fed will make missteps in any one of those three directions, given that we have absolutely very little knowledge of the state of the economy and of what is going on. I was fortunate enough to have breakfast with newly installed governor, my former student, Lisa Cook, a few days ago, and we did not talk about monetary policy. Instead, we talked about the history of Russia since even the Fourth Rurik and general financial crises, plus the various pieces of Washington gossip, plus the progressive era offensive and destruction of the African-American talented 10th, among other things. But at the end, I did say that I did not envy her for her job, or for any of them. For their jobs. They have a very difficult task and we're cheering them on.
Thank you, Brad, for your answers. Kate, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I'm going to ask a question that I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer based on what you've said a little bit so far, but I would just love you to elaborate more on sort of what determines these inflection points. I know, so you'd said in your discussion with Nick that you were a little bit surprised that 2008, 2009 became one of these inflection points for sort of small reasons. And just so I'm curious whether there's like a threshold of inequality and low productivity that you just reach a threshold point. And then my sort of second follow-up is how much does the ability to rewrite social relations impact those threshold points and those inflection points?
I don't know, right? 2008 was a huge shock because I thought it had been well established in the 1870s. That when a financial crisis comes, you do indeed accept all the rotten fruit being thrown at the financial system for its having undertaken unwise risks and for previous failures of regulation. But then actually in the financial crisis, you lend freely at a penalty rate on collateral that is good in normal times, because the most important thing is to keep the flow of payments and money keep going. And that, as Governor Donald Cohen of the Fed said back then, you do not want to put millions of people out of work to teach thousands of financiers who behave very badly a lesson. So you lend freely at a penalty rate on collateral that is good in normal times to institutions that are solvent but illiquid, and you nationalize institutions that are insolvent. Right? That was the rule set out by Walter Bagehot, economist editor in the 1870s, and Charlie Kindleberger pushed it, and I thought it was generally agreed. And lo and behold, Lehman Brothers arrives. And the Federal Reserve does not lend freely to it at a penalty rate on collateral that is good in normal times, but lets it go into an uncontrolled bankruptcy. And then says, well, we are legally prohibited from lending to it because it's an insolvent institution. But if Lehman Brothers is insolvent in the fall of 2008, it didn't become massively insolvent on that day. It had been insolvent but liquid for months, if not years before, in which case it would be massive central banking malpractice if you do not have the legal power to lend to an institution because it's insolvent, you also should not let it hang around because it's a potential source of catastrophe. And if it is insolvent, well, then you Treasury Secretary can go out and say, I think Lehman Brothers is insolvent. And then lo and behold, he gets to nationalize it the following day. The failure to even understand what I thought the accepted playbook about dealing with financial crises was. Plus, come January 2010, and the failure to understand what I thought was the Keynesian playbook about dealing with depressions was, which is that when the private sector sits down and stops spending, the public sector has to stand up and spend. That all of a sudden, the fact that neoliberal views about how someone deserves to be punished for this, and about how people shouldn't get incomes that more income and more wealth than they deserve, and some people have acted badly, and that we must not give some people more income than they deserve, even if the consequence is a worldwide depression. That made me think that the system was a lot, that I've been thinking that the system for distributing and utilizing our wealth had been, well, not fully, completely, tightly wrapped. There'd been at least some wrapping there. And then, lo and behold, it seemed completely unwrapped. As has our failure to do anything effective about global warming between, say, 1993, when we got within one Senate vote of the BTU tax, and, last July, convinced me that our system was pretty badly unwrapped. That we are failing at the task of rewriting the societal running code to properly couple with changing technology to a much greater degree than I had thought. And so that was kind of the sea change, which changed the notional end of the book from a kind of, rah-rah Frank Fukuyama liberal democracy end of history. It's been a rough and rocky road, but we're still in a pretty good place. To a more shadowy, are we in a good place? Or are we stuck in a hedonic treadmill of some kind in which, yes, our technological powers are marvelous and increasing, but, we're using them well. That we're not generating what everyone centuries ago would have thought would be what would happen in a world of abundance, which would be one of unicorns and parties and deep philosophical thoughts. Instead, we have technological powers vastly outstripping those of previous utopian writers. And yet I look around, I see old people terrorized by others who seek to cynically glue their eyeballs to screens so they can sold fake diabetes cures and crypto grifts. I see drought and hunger and famine still things, maybe more this year because of the southern move of the monsoon. I see killer robots stalking the skies above Ukraine and Syria. And I see in what is one of the richest neighborhoods in the world, the one in which I live, a quarter mile away, there is now a man living in a box. Right? That's not what Francis Bacon or Tommaso de Camposella or Edward Bellamy or even Aldous Huxley would have seen us as doing with our technological powers. George Orwell might have seen it, but even George Orwell's was more organized. Right?
In the classic form of an economics discussion, I've got more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
But as Kate framed this question around inflection points, it immediately reminded me of this tweet that I saw from Ethan Mollick a few days ago. Apparently there's a study that found that we don't know if we are in historic times while we are living through them. And it's a paper that was, the lead author is Joseph Reese, and they studied 2 million diplomatic cables. And it turns out that, as these events were unfolding, it was unclear how to, prioritize what is history making and what isn't, which I just thought was fascinating, because sometimes I do wonder, is the sky falling? Is this it? I remember having a conversation with a member of Congress I used to work for, who'd been in office longer than I'd been alive, and asking him, is this the worst time? And then when he started answering yes, then I started to get concerned.
All right. My view is that if things aren't as bad as they were on November 17th, 1942, we're not living in the worst time. And things really are not nearly as bad as they were on November 17th, 1942. You know, killer robots stalking the skies and terrorized people with eyeballs glued to screens just so they can be sold ads to things that won't make them happy, to the side, as we have them to the side.
Well, I keep returning to this idea that you've presented of our government and society and economy running on hardware and software. I think this is such a great metaphor to use because,
yes.
I mean, that is kind of what we're facing right now, right? I mean, we set up this hardware 250 years ago with our three branches of government. And I do kind of think that the issue we're facing is fundamentally like one group does not want to update the software anymore. Even says we want to go back to an older version. Another group wants to continue updating the software, and we kind of underreact or overcorrect based on the situations that we're facing. I think that actually explains a lot of the issues that we're facing right now. And I'm actually kind of afraid, are we going to become an iPod one day? You know, I still have an iPod in a shoebox somewhere, but I don't use it anymore because the software isn't updated anymore, right?
Yeah. You know, as Keynes wrote in 1924, in fact, in a review of a book Leon Trotsky had written, you know, that no political party has ideas written for the future. They all are rooted in the past. None more so, he said, than the Marxists. And so all inapplicable to the circumstances in which we are today. Hence, he said, the next move must be with the head.
Yeah, I mean, because that could also be, this kind of explains too, I think, why there's been so much more attention on the Fed, because the Fed's not supposed to be the software engineer, but they're playing that role.
It's supposed to do an extremely light-handed version, or extremely light touch version of central planning, of guiding macroeconomic aggregates so that the von Hayekian market can actually has a chance of working its magic, because at least some prices will be properly aligned with social values. And, you know, it's kind of a dirty secret that it is an economic central planner. And when that's pointed out to people in America, a lot of potential support for it, you know, falls away when it's simply the guardian of monetary stability. There are lots of people who think it's a nice thing. When they say it's a light touch central planner, a lot fewer people like it at all. And indeed, it was Milton Friedman who decided we should portray it as the guardian of monetary stability. And so kind of won it a great deal of its place in American society.
I'm going to ask a question sort of looking forward a little bit.
Okay.
You just made the point that people's ideas are always from the past. So it's hard to figure out how to look forward. And I think the one big takeaway for me is looking forward. The constraint is, as you noted, is climate change. And can this be viewed, you know, you talked about the problem of growing the pie and then grappling with the social relations needed to figure out how you divide that pie. So the problem of global warming, is it existentially different than the previous problem of growing the pie? Or can there be similar sort of technological advancements that we have a hard time foreseeing perhaps, but is that the challenge now? And is that a problem that is solvable, or could it be solvable in your way of thinking about this?
Well, yeah, it is a problem of slicing and tasting. It's a problem of distribution and utilization, right? That, you know, the global north grew rich and industrialized using carbon-based energy, you know, using solar power, you know, except that the solar power was from the sun 500 million years ago. And instead of collecting its energy in batteries, it was collected in plants and then put under the earth and then crushed. And then lo and behold, the last round of glaciers scrape off all the post-Permian rock off of the places. And lo and behold, the coal is here at the surface, and it's a wonderful thing to burn. But now the monsoon is 200 miles south of where it usually is, which, given that we have 3 billion people whose livelihoods depend on there being on the monsoon being in the right place, and that there be enough water and not too much water at the right time in the right place coming down the 6 great rivers of Asia. It's a huge problem, and it's a huge distributional problem for the 3 billion relatively poor people in Asia, as opposed to those of us in the United States for whom we just have an extra oppressive heat wave every summer. And maybe the climate is marching 3 miles north on average year by year. And also the problem of utilization, right? That if we are willing to make the investments, we can decarbonize very, very quickly. And it is no longer very expensive to do so. Back in 1993, when I was doing policy planning for the Clinton administration, we were saying we really would have to make the economy significantly less energy intensive in order to deal with global warming, hence Al Gore's BTU tax. Now, it's already potentially cheaper, especially if you incorporate some geopolitical risk premiums and surcharges into carbon energy prices, what with Vladimir Putin and others stocking the world. And what we really need to do is make the investments, the upfront investments, in order to get to a place where it's actually cheaper to use solar and other renewables. So that, I think, is very hopeful.
Okay, so we are ending on a hopeful note then, because we are approaching the end of the hour, and I think maybe.
And we do have I would say that mercenary and fiduciary institutions. Karl Polanyi had a younger brother named Michael Polanyi, who was actually quite a Hayekian in his way. But he would like to talk about, mercenary institutions like the market economy, which, if properly tuned, was absolutely wonderful for dealing with problems of scarcity. But also fiduciary institutions like that of modern science, which are absolutely wonderful at dealing with problems of information and which work very, very differently, but are equally as productive and equally as wonderful. And, I would add that there's a Stanford political philosopher named Josiah Ober, a classicist, who is trying to get us to view democracy and democracy accompanied by discussion as essentially the same kind of thing, only again, not a mercenary, but another fiduciary institutions. One for knowledge, but not for knowledge about the world, but for knowledge about human affairs. That democracy being a uniquely good institution for crowdsourcing all of us, because we can all speak in the public sphere and all get our ideas put forward and then have procedures for voting and judging which ideas are the best. And there are 8 billion of us. And yes, even though each of us is only a jumped up monkey with a brain, barely able to remember where I've put my car keys on a good day. Collectively, all 8 billion of us are an enormously intelligent intelligence, enormously brilliant anthology intelligence. We ought to be able to solve the problems of distribution and utilization. We have solved the problem of life extension. Everyone in the world now has a life expectancy at birth of 70 or more, compared to 25 for 2 centuries ago. And we are rapidly solving the problem of productivity, that industrial society is spreading throughout the world. So hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the big takeaway message is reminding myself the next time I'm feeling pessimistic about society and the economy, that someone standing at literally any other point in history would be amazed by where we are today.
Yes.
So
And kudos to my graphic designer who put Utopia in much bigger letters. So
And
it looks
can I-
like Utopia, and that was their decision, not mine, although I didn't nuke it when it came by.
now, can I ask, is, as a bookstore owner, is the title an intentional allusion to Joan Didion?
Joan Didion and us to Joan Didion's source as well. You know, that Joan Didion slouching towards Utopia is that these countercultural people in San Francisco think that they are leading a better life, but, you know, it's really weird there. And I'm not so sure. And she is then echoing William Butler Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, which is William Butler Yeats looking back at, you know, the British imperialism, World War I, you know, the Irish Revolution and Civil War, and saying, what rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem to be born.
So yeah,
You know,
bringing back
I
the history of
needed
the
a
long
working,
century.
I needed a working title, and because if you did so steal it, and you steal from the best, William Butler Yeats is the best, and I never was able to think of a better title.
Well, this is great. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and
You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you to Nick
Okay.
and Kate for
Excellent.
participating.
Thank you.
You can
Great.
pick up this book at Friendly City Books.
Thank you.
We are on bookshop.org, which has a network of 1,500 independent bookstores. And this book, along with Nick's, is available there. Check us out. Follow us at Friendly City Books BKS on Twitter. Brad's on Twitter at DeLong. Nick and Kate are also on Twitter. Nick, is your Twitter handle your full name?
Yes, at Nick Timiraos.
At Nick Timiraos, and then Kate's at Lipstick Econ, which, I mean, frankly, she's got the best Twitter handle of all of us, I have to say.
Does.
It's a decent one. It's up there with a few others. Like Brad DeLong, you might know Sandila Clutchwayo, who's also a Berkeley alum who is fem economics. So there's a few of us out there making jokes with their Twitter handles as a way to change the narrative.
Yep.
Yeah, so we'll be sharing this video on Twitter and on LinkedIn and all the other, video platforms that we did not use today. But appreciate everyone who's gotten to this point in the conversation. Hope you read the book and enjoy the book, and tweet us what your thoughts are.